Welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you here. My name's Elizabeth West. I'm the editorial director of the BTN Group, and we have some amazing panelists with us today, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you, starting on my right.
Hello.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Hello, everybody. My name is Rich Johnson, and I look after Solutions Group for CWT, which is the consulting arm of CWT.
All right, thanks, Rich. And I'll go to my other in-person panelists today. So, Karen, if your reputation precedes you, of course, but...
Oh, dear, that's not good. Karen Hutchings, Global Head of Travel, Meetings and Events from EY. And sorry we're late. We're getting used to the technical streaming and in-person, but the guys sorted it out. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And that's true. The hybrid event is part of our whole pandemic experience, right? So many meetings are moving to this type of format and still working through the details, I must say. So welcome to our virtual panelists as well. Carrie, why don't you go first with a little introduction, name and title, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kerry Henshaw-Cox. I'm the Global Travel Lead at AstraZeneca, biopharmaceutical company. I can only see Andrew at the moment, so I have no idea how many are in the room, how many I'm talking to, but thank you for allowing me to join this virtually today.
Thank you, Carrie. And I will just say there is standing room only. So this is a popular session and you're part of the draw. So thank you for being here. And Andrew, please tell us a little bit about you as well.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for this invitation. I'm Andrew Murphy. I'm the Aviation Director of Transport and Environment, a Brussels-based sustainable transport advocacy group.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So let's get started. I didn't print out anything today, but these are new for me, so bear with me as I try to read and see. All right, so let's go with a poll question for the audience. First thing, where's my poll guy? He's here. You're pushing out the poll to our app, which is Swapcard, right? So get your phones out. Let's push that poll question. I'll read it to you as well. So the poll question is, has your company made a carbon emissions reduction pledge that is impacting now or will impact how travel is managed? And if our digital poll takes a minute, we might do a show of hands. So I know, Karen, that EY has made a pledge of this kind. Tell us a little bit about that as we get the polling situated.
So we came out with an announcement in January, and that was around our carbon emission reduction targets. Specifically for business travel, that was saying that we would reduce our business travel emissions by 35% by 2025. And that is against the 2019 baseline. Additionally, we also stated that all of the supplier partners that we worked with, 75% of them, not just across travel meetings and events, but across all of our categories in procurement, needed to have set a science-based target as well also by 2030. So there are two significant elements that we are very involved with from a travel meetings and events perspective, because the reality is that the emissions from EY, 70% is contributed from business travel. So what that ultimately means for us is a reduction in the volume of travel that we do.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And I know as a consulting company, the amount of carbon emissions attached to travel is generally quite high. Yeah. So Carrie, I'd like to ask you the same question. Does AstraZeneca have a carbon reduction target by 2030 or by some other year? Because I know you've been very aggressive at EY about the timing, but tell us a little bit about AstraZeneca and what those targets may be if you have them.
Yeah, so very similar to Karen and to EY. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Great. So very similar to Karen and EY, that the company AstraZeneca has a whole team, a whole project, and a whole focus on sustainability across all areas of the business. So AZC, Achieve Zero Carbon, is a mantra that we're now following. So across our manufacturing plants, across our sites and our offices, but specifically around business travel, because that's our focus for today. We are looking to achieve zero carbon by 2030. And on the route to that for next year, we've worked on a target of a 50% reduction in business travel emissions based on 2019 as our baseline.
And we'll talk a little bit about how you get there. It's a very important distinction, the reduction of emissions versus the reduction of travel. So,
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to go to Andrew for 1 second. Andrew, in terms of your business, do you operate a carbon neutral business? Do you have targets that you have in place? I know that we may not all be travel buyers, but it's good to know what companies and organizations are doing.
Yeah, so we track our emissions, and we have an internal policy to use a train where responsible, and to avoid traveling if the meeting's objectives can be achieved through virtual meetings. Mm-hmm. So, for example, a lot of our work will be meeting with officials in different capitals to discuss European legislation. If that can be done with virtual meetings rather than have to go in person, then that's preferred. So that's our overall policy.
Very good, thank you. And Rich, what about CWT? Do you have targets?
Yeah, well, CWT's been doing things for quite a while. So since 2013, we've been reporting on our own emissions, and internally we've set up a global climate task force with a number of key stakeholders across the business, headed up by a VP of Sustainability, designed to achieve carbon reductions, and we focus on a number of domains. For example, ethics and behaviours, responsible products and services. We also sign up to a number of key global standards, such as the UN Global Compact, and most recently the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is obviously looking to achieve net zero by 2030.
Right. And tell me, if we have the poll ready to go, can we push those results, please? We need some drums and sound effects for this.
Will we see it on
I
here?
just saw that, so I think no.
No on the poll? Oh, you weren't able to.
So the hands will work.
Okay, so let's do a show of hands. All right. So the responses are to the poll question that your company has a pledge to be carbon neutral, and this is opposed to to net zero, carbon neutral by 2030 or before. Show of hands. Carbon neutral. Okay. Your company has pledged to be net zero by 2030 or before. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Your company has pledged to be carbon negative by 2030 or before.
I'm waiting for the EY people to put their hands up at some stage. There's a few in here.
And your company has not made a carbon reduction pledge. Your company has made one, but it's after 2030. Mm-hmm. I've talked to a few companies in that bucket. And then the others, you have not made a carbon reduction pledge at this time. Okay. All right. And how many of you just don't know? Because there's plenty, and it's okay to be in that bucket too. But everyone knows. So that's interesting, because I would suggest that 2 years ago, not everybody would have known what their company's carbon reduction plan or target was. So I think that in itself is a step in the right direction. All right. So let's move on to some of the other questions for our panelists. So what advice, Karen, do you have on setting emissions reduction targets specifically for business travel? We've heard about from Carrie the 50% reduction of emissions. What targets for business travel do you have, and how did you come to those decisions?
I'd love to say that I was very involved with the targets that were set. I'm more involved in having to deliver what leadership decided that they would be. But I think the good element of it is thinking about how can we actually deliver to the targets that they have set. And so I think it's a fine balance, though, in the fact that, you know, we've all spent 18 months not seeing people, and I think we all realise that we do want to see people. The reality is, though, is that if we really want to achieve what we've said that we're going to do, we're going to have to reduce the volume of travel that we do. And so what we've tried to be is just sensible about what we're looking at, though. So if we think about day trips as an example of flights, that represented around 18% of all of our air journeys. Well, actually, we've not had to do any day trips over the last 18 months, so that's an easy win for us to be able to eliminate the day trips. The other part of what Andrew talked about earlier is about the rail, so using rail instead of air and the difference that that can bring. And then finally, we've been focused on the number of people that go to the same meeting. So if there was ordinarily 10 people going to a meeting, perhaps it'd only be 5 go. And what we've done is implemented our robotic automation processes to actually challenge individuals as they book. Now, we've got 3 months grace as it stands at the minute because we've really not done any travel in our financial year. And we anticipate that there's going to be a peak at some stage as the skies open up, the borders open up. So we realise that there is going to be travel that will happen. However, we've got the processes ready now so that when it does come back, we can control it. And I think that's what it is, really is about creating visibility for budget holders, for approvers, so that they actually understand what they're approving as well. But certainly we don't want to eliminate business travel because we all know that connections of people is crucial to do business, and especially in the consulting world, we're selling our people more than anything else, but it's just about doing it smarter, and I think that's what we've tried to instigate and we've got in place now.
Tell me about the robotics, robotics automation. What sort of challenges are you putting in that booking workflow or even after a booking happens that might sort of cause people to stop and consider? Give me some examples of what you're kind of putting within the workflow to...
So to use an example would be the volume of people going to the same meeting. So we basically have approvals in place for all travel. And so what we've actually added into that now is that if it's the same engagement code, you know, cost center for another term, date and destination, we will tell the approver, they'll approve the first trip, then number 2, number 3, number 4 comes, and then it will be highlighted to say, did you know that you've actually approved somebody to already go on this trip? Do you want this other 10 to go as well? These sort of things you can't do manually, candidly, and so the fact that we have RPA that can help us be able to do that and challenge means that it gives the visibility for the budget holder and also the approver. So that's just a simple example of how we were using robotics there.
Right. And the robotics is something that EY has developed internally. It's not that you went to an external provider for that. So are there providers in the space, and this is a question for anyone, are there any providers in the space who are helping to work on something like this? Is this would this be a third-party technology? Would this be a TMC putting something sort of additionally into an instance of a booking tool? How would we? Are there providers that could help us with things like this, or is this an internal developed EY only situation?
We're happy to talk to anybody.
I'm sure you are. All right. No answer on that. Okay. So, Carrie, why don't you tell me, similar to Karen, I've got Carrie and Karen, so it's a little tough, guys. Why don't you tell me similarly what you're doing within AstraZeneca and some of the strategies that you're taking to reduce business travel emissions?
Yeah, so you've got KK here then,
Yeah.
Karen and Kerry. So for us, the focus on reducing travel, as I said earlier, we're looking to target a reduction of 50%. And the 4 key areas that we're trying to keep the message simple is avoid, reduce, substitute, and compensate. So if we can keep repeating that message, avoid, reduce, substitute, and compensate, hopefully that will settle with our travellers and our bookers when they're thinking about travelling. So avoid, obviously, can you not make that trip? So Karen talked about one-day meetings. One of the focus areas we've had is on internal meetings, looking at the reason for travel. And back in 2019, 61% of all of our travel was for internal meetings. So we really are questioning that and the need to travel from site to site between internal employees and a real focus on that. So does that actually have to happen? Do you need it to happen as often? Could it be avoided? Have we learnt to use virtual technology during the pandemic so that we don't need to travel for internal meetings as much as we used to? Reduce can be the focus, like Karen said, on the number of attendees at meetings. And in the pharmaceutical world, we attend a lot of congresses and we have high numbers of people from so many countries attending congresses. So there's a big question about reducing the number of attendees, not a question, a directive to reduce the number of attendees at a particular congress. And actually congress organisers are helping, like we are today, by starting to introduce hybrid versions of meetings, so that Andrew and I have joined virtually in a mixed meeting. So in the pharmaceutical world, that's a focus area, to have hybrid meetings. Substitute is looking at better ways of travelling, whether that's using a greener or more sustainable supplier for that journey, or whether it's doing something like travelling by train rather than air. And we're actually working with Concur and other suppliers to say, could you influence traveller decisions at the point of booking to say for these, let's say our top 10 routes where there is a rail option, that will be shown, provided or mentioned, whether that's using the online booking tool or getting our BCD agents to direct travellers in that way. And then compensate is when you absolutely have to make that business trip, and we are saying that for international travel it still needs to be business critical, how do we offset that? How do we compensate for when we have to make a trip? So in order to manage that and support those 4 areas, the approval process, like Karen said, is really important. You have to have a stricter approval process. You have to make that message really clear, and people need to know where they go for the right level of approval, for the right level of trip, if we're focusing on sustainability.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Actually, I'm going to go to Rich, and Andrew, just sit tight for 1 second. I do have a question for you, and I want to go to Rich really quick.
Sure.
What is the TMC's role? So Carrie just brought up that their BCD agents, are involved in this process, and what is the role of the agency? It's more than the agents. It's from top to bottom, I would assume.
Yeah, I think the role of the TMC is a multifaceted one, because we like to see ourselves more as a partner rather than just as a supplier to the companies that we work with. Our responsibility ranges from offering the right technologies and the right user experience for individuals when they're making bookings, through to being able to provide data, but data in a meaningful way. Data that doesn't necessarily need to be interpreted, but actually insights that accompany that data is also, I think, a fundamental responsibility of a TMC. Absolutely, you mentioned the agents, Beth. The agents do need to be, of course, fully conversant with customer travel policies and making sure that they are guiding and making bookings in a way in which Kerry and Karen would expect their travellers to make those bookings. But it also does need to be supplemented with the right technologies, and those technologies can be in the form of approval processes, which try to create electronic checks and balances at the point of booking, but also ways to try and nudge travellers to make the right choices at the point of making the booking. Because so when I mentioned reporting and insights, that's incredibly powerful, but it is after the fact, and that has a limitation on its own. So being able to nudge travellers to make the right decisions at the start as it relates to sustainability is very important. As CWT is aggressively looking at that at the moment. I know there's some organisations in the room who we are talking with. Also, I won't name them, but that's what I would say.
So if I can dig in on that just a little
Yeah,
bit.
sure.
So the decision making at the point of sale, of course, yes, the reporting after the fact, so that you can see where you've been and what the opportunities are. But at the point of sale is such a pivotal moment. How are you looking at that? Is it messaging? Is it numbers? Is it tags that you've sort of agreed with the client that these are the top 3? Are you all of the above? What strategies are you looking at the point of sale to communicate with the traveler? Because honestly, we can put everything in place, but it really depends on that traveler selection at the point of sale, whether this succeeds.
That's a really good question. There's a number of ways. So yes, absolutely messaging, and also to do with the education of the counsellor community, so that when they're interacting with customers, they're also
Right.
mirroring the same kind of messaging that you would see in an electronic format. Also, helping customers to develop the right policy components, and then making sure that those are housed within the TMC system, so they're accurately reflected when we try and make the bookings, is really important. The next stage of that, specifically as it relates to sustainability, is about making the right supplier choices. So imagine you've got 5 airlines to choose from when you're going Heathrow to JFK. How do you know which is the best one to choose? And I think that's becoming table stakes in terms of a piece of technology that customers are expecting, because from that they can then say, you were given every opportunity to make the right choices, and they can start to hold people accountable within their own organisations for not necessarily following what they should have done.
And I want to dig into more of that supplier conversation too,
Sure.
sort of how do you get to identifying those suppliers? So that'll be in a minute. I want to get to Rich. Rich, thank you so much for your patience.
I'm Rich.
Oh my God, did I do that wrong? Oh, yes. Sorry. I want to get to Andrew. I'm so sorry, Rich and Andrew.
That's okay.
I want to get to Andrew on our screen. Goodness. So, Andrew, we have some interesting developments happening sort of in the larger perspective on sustainability. And I wanted to get your view about the forthcoming COP26 conference in Glasgow. And that's happening next month, will that have an impact on business travel sustainability strategies?
Yeah, I think there's going to be 2 big impacts from it. I think firstly, it's going to reinforce and echo what we've heard recently from the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, which is a need to bring about immediate reductions in CO2 and some of the other warming effects. Remember, the reason aviation is getting such a big focus on climate issues is because it's not just the CO2 effects of flying, but it's also the substantial non-CO2 effects of flying. So we're going to see that big focus on aviation. And the second thing we may see coming out of Glasgow is further problems with the issue of offsetting. One of the technical issues we're seeing in Glasgow is that trying to make offsetting compatible with the Paris Agreement. It's clear that offsetting has no future, because ultimately offsetting isn't about reducing the combustion of fossil fuels. It's about efforts to try and escape or avoid reducing the combustion of fossil fuels. So we are going to see more focus on it, but I think what we're also seeing is sort of a positive reaction to that, and saying, well, look, okay, we can't fly as much. How do we adjust to a world where we can't fly as much? We are seeing these exciting conversations take place around different ways to stay in contact, to really question the value of flying. I mean, I think what's interesting about the global economy is that it's so much broader and more international than it was even 10 or 20 years ago. So many companies have different activities, different customers spread around 5 continents. And maybe it's not as possible to physically transport bodies to different parts of the world where they may have operations or customers. And instead we're seeing more efficient ways of communicating and staying in touch that's required in a world where aviation is so dependent on fossil fuels. So we can't depend on aviation as much as we did in the past.
I want to actually underscore something that I think I heard you say. Did you say carbon offsetting has no future? Is that what you
Yeah.
said? Yes, that's
So-
what I thought you said. Okay, how many agree carbon offsetting is a questionable measure? Yeah. Okay, we got a lot of agreement in the room. Thank you for that. And in terms of, and so you've said fossil fuels for airlines as well. Why don't you give us your view on sustainable aviation fuel? And because these are kind of bigger picture issues that we are hearing a lot about right now, Andrew. But as travel managers, we may not be experts on these specifics. So give us your insights on sustainable aviation fuel and how that fits into the picture, or if it does.
So SAFs definitely have the potential to reduce the climate impact of aviation. But I have two caveats about that. First is that there can be some very negative alternative fuels, such as those from crop-based biofuels, which can actually drive issues like deforestation or drive up the price of food. So travel managers need to be very careful about what fuels they use. Secondly, it will take some time to scale up the production of truly sustainable fuels. Right now, aviation is almost 100% reliant on fossil fuels. It's a very unusual sector for that level of reliance. And so until we can really scale up SAFs, the most effective step we can take to reduce emissions from flying is to fly less. And it's disappointing that's where we are, because, you know, sometimes connecting people physically is great, but the reality is governments haven't been taking the big steps to reduce emissions from flying, to deploy new technology. So really right now, flying less is, at least for the next 10 years, the most effective way to reduce emissions from flying.
So I'm interpreting a little bit of what you're saying here. Reducing flying will reduce demand for sustainable air fuel. So you are saying also that it is a government responsibility to push forward those initiatives because the demand is actually going to be reduced if we reduce flying.
Well, so long as aviation is so reliant on fossil fuels, reduced demand for flying will primarily reduce demand for fossil fuels. And it will also undermine the case for example, expanding airport capacity, which is what we're seeing, you know, here in Europe, where a number of airports were planning to expand. Now, if people fly less, does that mean demand for SAF will reduce? Well, no. Companies can fly less, but when they do fly, demand more SAF. You know, it's a bit like trying to stay healthy. It's a combination of exercise and a combination of eating better. So flying less is the exercise, and demanding more SAF is the better diet. And we need both if we're going to have a more sustainable way of getting around the world.
Great, thank you for answering that question. That was a great answer.
Beth, can I have
Yeah,
a perspective
please,
on that,
come
please,
in,
if you
come
don't
in,
mind?
come in.
I saw a really interesting piece of analysis that was done by Accenture, and they were talking about the fact that in 2019, 0.1% of jet fuel used by commercial airlines was sustainable aviation fuel. And their projection was that by 2050, that could be somewhere in the range between 25% and 75% market share, but that's going to be very dependent on things like technology developments. I did a webinar recently where Facebook and United Airlines were on the panel with me, and they were talking about the fact that there needs to be an acknowledgement that maybe to achieve certain economies of scale, there needs to be a realization that in the short term, it might be more expensive to get there, and that's almost the trade-off that needs to be made. So although still relatively expensive, you know, if a couple of things happen, for example, if globally blending mandates start to come in on sustainable aviation fuel, or if carbon costs become more expensive, that's going to focus the mind, I think, a little bit more on using SAF to a greater extent, and then that ultimately is going to start to bring the prices down. So obviously, as a TMC, I'm not going to sit here and advocate people travel less, but you know, at the same time, I think there are ways to do it in a way that doesn't destroy the environment.
Yeah. Can I go to Carrie and Karen for a minute? K&K. I'd like to know if you have sustainable aviation fuel initiatives in place. I'm going to leave it at that because I think I know some things that you're doing, but I won't lead the witness as it were. Why don't we start with Karen and then we'll go to Carrie. Do you have sustainable aviation fuel initiatives?
We do have some. We've not formally announced anything. We have a different challenge than most in that most airlines are clients to us. And so that makes it very different about what we may talk about and not talk about. I think one thing to mention though, and it goes into what we were talking about earlier on about the point of sale, there's a 20% differential in emissions based on the type of aircraft that you fly on a particular route. And I think sometimes we forget about that, about the choices. And so at the minute, the booking tools, the agencies and everything do averages.
Right.
And I think that's a challenge out there. And so, again, we are developing something internally with APIs that will actually give us that granular information to know what the difference is by aircraft type, train, or whatever it is, because a 20% differential is very large. And at the minute, there's no way that we can actually give that information at the point of sale. So I mention that because we can talk about SAF, but actually if we can enable our employees to make better decisions, then that drives our reduction anyway as well. But certainly going back to your question, we are speaking to airlines around SAF. There was an illusion out there that you could have a plane that's full of SAF aviation fuel and fly to New York with that particular plane. That is not the reality. And I think this is part of the journey that we're all on now, is learning about how this works, because 18 months ago, we wouldn't have known that actually, if an airline says they've got 10% sustainable aviation fuel, everybody that flies on that airline will experience part of that 10%. Right. So I think we as corporate buyers have a responsibility to put the pressure on to actually get more sustainable aviation fuel and potentially tolerate the price increases that comes with. Now, for the airline people in the room, that doesn't mean that our rates need to go up. But on the other hand, I do think, though, we have to be sensible. And it's what Andy said earlier. You know, if we are serious about doing something to reduce the temperature of the planet, then there's a price to pay. And actually, that's okay, though, because if you think about the fact that we're going to reduce emissions by 35% through business travel, that's a significant amount of money that we're actually going to save as a result of that anyway. Right. So, yeah.
It may even out a bit in the end. So we may not be, that's another question that I'll ask later about, sourcing suppliers and the sourcing process, and does leverage go down when you reduce your travel? But we'll talk about that in a minute. Carrie, I want to go to you and ask about SAF initiatives that AstraZeneca might have in play.
Likewise, very early days for us. It is a focus to look at what our suppliers are doing, and we work closely with airlines to understand what they're investing in. But I'd be very interested in some of what Andrew is saying about what is it, what does it mean, what is the cost, what is the impact, because there are so many considerations here. It isn't just about sustainable fuel and an airline using that. There's so many other factors, the weight loading, the spread of economy and business class passengers on that flight, the freight usage on that flight, and all the things that we're still at the very early stages of this. So we haven't published anything about our stance, but as travel sits within procurement, we're very much making it part of our supplier relationship management process, part of the sourcing process, so that sustainability is really on the agenda with all of our conversations with our suppliers. And yes, for airlines and hotels and other suppliers in the room, we're very interested to hear what your approach to sustainability is as part of our preferred supplier program.
Yeah. Any suppliers in the room want to talk about maybe what their initiatives are and what insights they bring to the table? Anyone want to stand up and impromptu? No? Nobody. All right, we'll have to do that on the side, Carrie. Thank you for the prompt, though. That would have been great. All right. Let me ask the audience a poll question. I know that we don't have our digital polling going, but I think it is important to get a read on the audience of sort of how your companies are working towards reducing carbon emissions. So let me put my eyes back on. So my second poll question, do any of the following figure into your company's strategy for carbon emissions reduction? So just show of hands on each one. Overall travel reduction or diversion to virtual meetings. That's everybody, maybe? I think so. Well, okay. I won't speak for.
Someone just put their full beam on that projector or
Yeah.
something.
Oh, we could probably cut this, guys. The light on the projector. We
That
don't
did
need-
increase
we
in
don't need all
brightness
that,
suddenly, didn't
right?
it? I
Yeah,
just-
that really did.
Wow.
Here, why don't we just move a bit so that
Thank
you're
you.
out of the line of fire?
Otherwise, I'll probably fall off the stage.
Yeah, we don't want you to go blind. All right, there. Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay, all right. All right. So we got the virtual meetings. SAF initiatives. Anybody in the audience with SAF initiatives? Okay, great. Thrust guys in the front. Carbon offsetting. It's okay. Carbon offsetting. Yeah, not surprising to see. Air travel reduction or travel alternatives, which is, I mean, more modalities like air to train or air, yeah. Okay. And carbon capture or sequestration, I know there's a few, yeah. And sourcing more sustainable travel partners and solutions. Yeah, okay, good, big effort there. Other, is there anything I did? Oh, carbon budgets. Oh, friends in the back. You guys need to talk. Other. What else are you doing? Oh, electric aircrafts. That's exciting. Short haul.
So it's United Airlines, and it's looking at a range of different things for the future, because we have to try and see how we move the conversation forward.
Yeah.
And consider what else might be out there, making those investments now, thinking ahead.
Can I ask your company?
United Airlines.
Oh, okay. So you're with United. Great. All right.
We had another hand.
Oh, another.
I'm representing a SAF producer here.
Oh, okay. Neste. Okay. Great.
We are bringing product to market to reduce the emissions of airlines and ultimately of the passengers and companies that are using it.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I hope you're enjoying the session. All right. Any others? No. And who doesn't know? Again, this is good progress. Just education, I think, is good progress. All right.
But Beth,
Yeah.
just the point on, because we kind of went offsetting into SAF there, and
Yeah.
I've always been quite cynical about the offsetting
Okay.
process, because I've always felt that it almost creates like a two-tier situation where, you know, the richest can afford to wash their hands of something
Absolutely.
and be able to afford to do so without actually fundamentally addressing the behaviours that some of the less able companies would do. But at the same time, if we think about travel in terms of short haul and long haul, there's really only, in my opinion, two major things that will contribute to decarbonisation of that at the moment, which is offsetting and sustainable aviation fuel. So personally, I'm a big believer in the future of SAF for that reason, because I think it's going to spell a bit of a death knell for the reliance on offsetting as a kind of, oh well, I can just pay to not worry about it.
And Andrew, do you agree with that? That the development of SAF is, you know, in inverse sort of relationship to the need for carbon offsetting
For long haul specifically.
for long haul specifically?
Yeah, I didn't quite catch the last bit, but I got your summary of the question. The idea is, can we keep offsetting until SAFs come along? Look, I mean, if you want to pay for a few trees to be planted, by all means, go ahead. I can't guarantee those trees won't burn down in 2 or 3 years, or that those trees were going to be planted anyway, or that the country where they're planted will claim those emission reductions for themselves. These are all the practical problems. But, you know, I can guarantee you, if you take that long haul flight, it will burn 99 to 100% fossil fuel. that's fossil fuel that's been in the ground for millions of years and is now in the atmosphere. And, you know, no offsetting you purchase is going to change that impact on the climate. And I think, you know, I think what frustrates me about this is we've spent so long on this offsetting program, including CORSIA, the carbon offsetting scheme that ICAO have come up with. And I genuinely think if we hadn't invented offsetting, we'd be in a better position, because we really spent a lot of time trying to make offsetting work. And that's just being an enormous distraction to what needs to happen, which is the world's economy needs to stop burning fossil fuels.
Completely agree.
Thank you. Let's talk about sourcing strategies, sourcing questions for your suppliers. We've talked a lot about air because that is a major, I think that's one of our, let's say it's our primary emissions target for travel. First of all, is that correct? Is it right that our focus should be on air? That's an open question to anyone who wants to answer it.
I'd let Andy answer that because I'm sure he's
No,
got
I
a
feel
strong
like
view on that.
I'm looking at him. And Andy, as our sort of larger perspective on the panel, air, hotel, rail, we already know is reduced emissions from air. So is air really where we should be focusing most of our efforts, or hotel just as important? We have certainly sustainability issues with hotels as well. Oh, Andy, are you hearing us?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, the question about hotels. I mean, this comes down to the question of kind of regulations, and oftentimes emissions from hotels, you know, they are already included in national climate targets. If you look at what's known as nationally determined contributions, they are the pledges in the Paris Agreement. The emissions in the construction operation of hotels, they're often included in the NDCs. The flights between countries aren't.
Okay.
And that's where the big problem is. You know, we talk about the technology solutions, and we're right to be excited about those solutions. But the big problem at the moment is we're simply not counting aviation emissions. And if you're not counting it, you know, the first step is admitting you have a problem. If you're not at that stage yet, we don't really see a path towards getting those technologies deployed.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's talk about sourcing, and let's talk about how we approach our suppliers with these new questions and new expectations. First of all, this is a show of hands in the room for the audience. How many of you make decisions based on answers to sustainability questions in your RFP? Are we at the point where we are making decisions to go with suppliers or not based on their sustainability responses? We have a little bit of this in the air. Yeah? So a few are at that stage. Definitely a couple of years ago, it was a lot fewer. So what kinds of questions, let's start with air, what kinds of questions are you asking of your air partners to elicit information that will be helpful for your decision making with those partners? Or if it's not just questions, what sort of programs are you looking for, that type of thing? We'll go with Karen first and then go to Carrie.
Well, the biggest one is what I highlighted at the start, is the fact that we said we want to work with 75% of our suppliers by 2025 needed to have set a science-based target. And so if you look at the aviation industry at the moment, not one has. In the hotel industry, 5 have, and another major US chain now has just gone out and announced that they're setting one. So that makes it quite tough from our perspective, because that's an actual goal at a company level that EY has set across all of our procurement categories. So 75% of our spend at the minute is not even close to having set SBT targets. So then it's looking at those. So what can we do differently? And, you know, we can talk about whether there's reusable plastics and those types of things. But there are some things, though, that we can drive as decisions. And so one thing that we did pre-pandemic was to say when there was an event that we do not want our linen changed, we do not want the towels changed. And only some hotels, though, could actually give us what that meant. And that's been the biggest challenge, is the fact that you can have these initiatives that actually will make some sort of difference, but it's very difficult to measure them. But saying that, though, I still think it's a great message internally to say that that's what we're doing, because what's happening around sustainability now and carbon emission reduction goals is the attractiveness of you as a company to encourage others to come and join. And I think there's a recent survey that we did when we were looking at actually around the tool we're building, how important would it be? And the overwhelming response from the younger minded employees, bearing in mind ours is the average age is 27, was that it was vitally important to them that EY was seen to be doing something. And so even if you can't measure everything and you can't make a decision based on some of the answers to the questions in this category that we're in, there are still major differences that we can push that will make some sort of difference. And collectively, if we keep asking those questions, it does change the industry as well. So the linen is a very simple one, but one that was real, and where the hotels, one hotel in particular did something for us because we had a major event there, and we had a kitchen built in Sudan as a result of the money that was saved. The messaging of that type of thing is huge, actually, and that's what we want to do more of, but very difficult to put into an RFP.
Yeah, very difficult. And I do see that sort of unique programs like that and unique sort of partnerships are one of the ways that travel managers are pushing change, is to drive these kinds of unique projects with their suppliers. So that's another way to do it. It doesn't have to just be all tied to RFP and measure.
Well, I think you have to be very careful that you think, well, it has to be measured. We can still make a difference without it being measured.
Yeah.
And it becomes the collective voice that takes it seriously. And really, that we need to create a groundswell with this. Mm-hmm. And just saying that there's no data doesn't create the groundswell.
Right. But data is a challenge, and we should be able to measure. So I don't want to discount the importance of measuring, but that's not a reason not to do it now, right? So, Carrie, let's go to you. How are you partnering with your suppliers? What questions are you asking of them to, make decisions or travel better together?
So apologies, I think Andrew and I are struggling with sound and background noise, so I didn't hear any of Karen's response. So if I repeat anything she said, I apologies up front. So our focus on in the sourcing approach comes from a higher level within procurement and from a company level as well. Sustainability covers a whole range of areas. So one is around the contribution to achieving this zero carbon targets, but the other is around contribution to an ethical spend across our supplier base. So the questions that we ask can also be around ethical and social sustainability to become a preferred supplier, as well as things like risk measurements that we put in place. But if I bring this back to travel, our questions are often based around how are they involved in recognised measurements. So things like EcoVadis, science-based targets. So how many of our suppliers are committed to science-based targets initiatives? And the questions that we ask them are not strictly yes and no answer, but more tell us about what you're doing, explain how you're approaching this. And at the moment, we don't have a preferred supplier list. In fact, it was on a call I've been on earlier this morning. We don't have a preferred supplier list that you have to currently tick the box on sustainability in order to be a preferred supplier. But I absolutely see that coming. And I don't think we're that far away from it either. That these questions that we ask will dictate whether you become a preferred supplier of the future. and be more part of the decision-making process.
There's a lot of nodding going on in the audience, Carrie. I just want you to know that there are so many people agreeing with you. And we do not have any more time. So I am going to end with that. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Very briefly, if I may.
Very briefly.
Very briefly.
Let's go.
So within CWT, we think about sustainability more in terms of the fitness for purpose and longevity of a travel program and how it remains suitable for the needs of the future. So we have an idea called ECO, which basically stands for Employee Climate Organisation, and it's about helping organisations to achieve the right level of balance between how much they spend, how much they impact their travellers, and how much they achieve that sustainability in an environmental context. So when we do sourcing on behalf of customers, we try to approach it from a point of view of saying, let's look at where each individual company is starting from and where they're trying to get to. And then we ask questions around those three areas to see where there's going to be a trade-off and how they score highly in areas of employee well-being impact and also climate sustainability. So we would look at things such as average age of fleet for the environmental context, of course, but we'd also ask them about things like initiatives to reduce single-use plastics. Bit difficult in the current situation with COVID, of course, but though just to give you a couple of examples, what we've been able to do is build a global repository of information specifically on airlines, so we can now assess who scores well across those areas and then advise customers in making the right choices. It's a bit more difficult with hotels because there's a qualitative and a quantitative requirement, and the quantitative is a little bit more tricky, as Karen rightly said. But certainly on air, which typically makes up about 70% of emissions anyway, in a program, that's something which we do with sourcing.
Thank you. That gives us a little more insights into how that sourcing process works. I want to thank everyone for joining today, our virtual panelists, Carrie and Andrew, and also our in-person panelists, Karen and Rich. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for the audience for participating. That was great. Thank you.